Folks, can I begin by acknowledging we're meeting today on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Ed Cavanough. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute. We're a public policy think tank that works with a cross-section of organisations, from unions to corporates, government departments to charities, on policy and advocacy and largely on industrial relations. And it's an honour to be here at the Sydney Institute. Gerard, thank you for having extended the McKell Institute this invitation and for all the work that you and Anne do at this institute, particularly creating such a thoughtful and civil forum for these really complicated and quite contentious debates. And thank you, Jessica, for being here too. Now, Jessica and I didn't actually know each other prior to tonight, but it's clear that you bring this formidable expertise in industrial relations into this discussion. But folks, can I cast your mind back to the eve of the 2022 election? In the weeks leading up to polling day, we heard ample criticism that the Albanese opposition was running a small target strategy, that their ambitions, if they were to take office, were too modest. And just about 2 years since that election, we now often hear the opposite from certain corners of our debate, that the Albanese government is going too far and that they're imposing some sort of radical left-wing agenda on Australia. Now, the critics that make this point point to the government's ambitious IR agenda as the evidence. We've even been told that it's all part of a union conspiracy, laden with hidden motives and paybacks. Well, folks, I hope tonight I can alleviate some of the concerns that you may have. Now, I accept that the government's IR plans have been truly ambitious. We don't have time this evening to go through every individual change. So what I wanted to do is explore some of the most contentious aspects of the government's IR agenda, which I view as broadly representative of their approach. And I hope to explain why this agenda is not inconsistent with the broader pursuit of building a more productive, more efficient and fundamentally fairer economy for both working people, but importantly, the risk takers that employ them. But I first wanted to start here. Back in 2020, I spent a few weeks traipsing around northern New South Wales, undertaking an investigative research project. Now, I was up in the Coffs Coast, one of the most beautiful parts of our country, but until very recently, it also had a very dark underbelly. About 15 years ago, the region began uprooting its bananas, replacing them with a much more lucrative crop, which was blueberries. And as this cash crop exploded, so too did the need for fast labour. Capitalising on a very weak regulatory environment, a cluster of bad faith labour hire firms and other intermediaries popped up in town, promising farmers cheap, quick workers in time for harvest. For many of the workers, their dream working holiday soon became a nightmare. The piece rates were manipulated, set at rates that meant achieving the minimum wage was next to impossible. And after deductions were made, some workers were earning as little as $3 to $4 an hour, and I saw this firsthand. Now, one of those workers was a German man named Garno, living in Australia doing everything right by his visa, but being let down by gaps in a system that were being exploited by this minority of bad actors who thought correctly that they could get away with it. Now, Garno was one of the 9% of Australian workers in Australia that the Grattan Institute just last year estimated are earning below the minimum wage. And that's a stat that doesn't just hurt workers, of course, it also hurts the vast majority of businesses that do not do the wrong thing. Now, thankfully, piece rates have been reformed and the sky didn't fall in, contrary to claims, but other gaps do remain. And I worry that if they're not fixed, there's room for bad faith operators to do similar harm. Now, it's in this context that the Albanese government's IR agenda has been pursued. And it focuses both on plugging some of these existing gaps while also preserving the features of a competitive, efficient labour market and restoring some bargaining power to those typically without any. Now, as I said, this agenda is certainly ambitious, but it isn't all a surprise. Most of the major changes that they are fulfilling were pre-election pledges. Now, the first major change came in late 2022 with the passage of the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act. Now, that saw quite a few changes. Changes to flexible work, pay secrecy, the abolition of the ACCI. But I think the most significant, certainly, of that bill was the expansion of what they call multi-employer bargaining. Now, effectively, this change expanded the ability of unions and workers to negotiate with more than one business at a time across industries, helping to achieve outcomes across highly disaggregated but also very low-paid sectors like the care economy. Now, one of the main arguments at the time against multi-employer bargaining was that it would both destroy jobs and lower pay. Well, it was passed 18 months ago, and the opposite has since eventuated. And I think the unfulfilled warnings that we saw during the debate on multi-employer bargaining is predictive of some of the outcomes that we expect to see with some of the more recently legislated changes. Now, I want to focus mainly on a few of the contentious pieces of the Closing Loopholes Bill, which was passed in 2 tranches over this summer. Now, this bill admittedly did a lot. It expanded delegate rights, right of entry for union officials, formalised definitions of employees and casuals, addressed unfair contract terms, and did much more. But I want to highlight and talk through 3 specific changes that I feel reflect the government's broader mission. Now, the first is same job, same pay. Ahead of the 2022 election, Labor committed to legislating the principle of same job, same pay, responding to the growing use of labour hire as a means by some employers, mainly a handful of large corporate employers, to avoid EBA conditions their direct employees were working under. Now, I want to be clear, I've got nothing against labour hire whatsoever. It can play a critical role, especially where short-term labour and specialist skills are required for a firm that doesn't have them. But few can genuinely concede that labour hire wasn't being used by a handful of companies, primarily to drive down wages. Now, Qantas famously created their own labour hire firms. They were subsidiaries of Qantas, through which they'd orient some new hiring, then contract labour from those firms at pay grades lower than their own established EBAs. Now, does anyone really think that's fundamentally fair, or being done in good faith, or being done to meet a genuine skill gap within Qantas? So I think it's clear in that case we had a problem. Now, when Labor did commit to this change, soon came, I think, quite a disingenuous scare campaign. We were told the bill, for example, would mean that employers could no longer reward good performing workers and recognise experience. But that was an interpretation that intentionally mischaracterised the title same job, same pay. Now, I think one of the reasons the crossbench never passed this bill was because they saw through some of that argument. Now, this bill does nothing to prohibit any employer rewarding expertise. It doesn't change EBAs themselves, and it doesn't change anything automatically. Any worker or union still has to make a claim to the Fair Work Commission if they believe labour hire is being misused. What it does do is create a check on mainly large companies exploiting labour hire simply to lower their wages bill. Now, I began by telling a story of Cavanough, the German backpacker who was getting paid just $3 an hour. Now, for the first time, the Closing Loopholes Bill treats intentional, systematic wage theft with the seriousness it deserves. It strengthens financial penalties, but it also imposes a new criminal sanction in the most egregious cases. And I'm glad that under the weight of growing evidence about the prevalence of wage theft in our economy, most of the traditional opponents to action on this area of policy have actually conceded that action is required. There has been, though, at times, I think, unrealistic scare campaigns on wage theft too. I've heard arguments, for example, in this latest round that the bill would potentially punish small businesses whose payroll systems genuinely malfunctioned. But the bill doesn't do that, and no court would view a genuine technical glitch as means or cause for criminal sanction. What it does do is punish and deter intentional underpayment. We need these laws, not just to protect workers like Cavanough, but to protect the vast majority of businesses that would never underpay their workers. Now, what I want to spend actually more time talking through is the very significant changes to gig work and the regulatory approach that the government has taken. And I want to do that because I genuinely believe this is one of the most significant reforms that the government has done since winning power. Now, its introduction of basic regulations and protections for gig economy workers is genuinely world-leading. And it's a pragmatic response to the gigification of work. It's an approach that accepts gig work exists, but disagrees that it should be a backdoor to lowering pay and conditions. Now, critics of these changes claim this reform approach is radical, and that by granting the Fair Work Commission powers to set minimum standards for regulated workers on these platforms, the entire contractor-employee dichotomy is being upended. But my contention is this: the government aren't the ones that upended that dichotomy. It was the gig economy proponents who fired the first shot, and the government's response is an inevitable response to a type of insecure work that was imposed upon our labour market by distant venture capitalists in San Francisco whose claim to be true innovators, in my view, stands on very shaky ground, because the great innovation of gig economy providers is not about their services, but it's in the mainstreaming of a form of work that skirts established labour laws and often the most basic of workplace rights. Now, this is nothing to celebrate. Gig economy work is often a form of work which a quarter of its participants routinely earn below the minimum wage, and of which all of the risks associated with working are borne solely by the worker. And we get told, don't worry, this is just, gig workers are just side hustlers, but the data shows that that's not the case. This is often their job. And it's a job that has no benefits. It's a job with no workers' compensation. It's a job where, in the most terrible of cases, if you die at work, which is the case for 14 workers tragically in Australia in this gig economy, your family's often subjected to lengthy court proceedings just to get compensation. And the gig economy platforms themselves are often completely AWOL in this process. So this is a deeply impersonal form of employment. It's a relic of the past that's being rebranded as a model for the future. And it's moving from rideshare to healthcare, cleaning to marketing and beyond. And the idea that any responsible government, let alone a Labor government, could look at this reality and not do anything, that is what would be radical. Now, I want to talk about, there's a few more aspects to this bill, of course, that I could talk about. But I want to turn to the consequences of the agenda overall, because so far much of the hyperbole that's framed the debate just hasn't materialised. Last week, we saw incredible jobs data released. We were told that the IR bills wouldn't create a single job, but the unemployment rate fell last month to 3.7%. Even my home state of South Australia recorded its lowest unemployment rate ever of just 3.2%. So, of course, certain provisions in the IR agenda are still trickling through, but I'm yet to see a serious impact on jobs. And meanwhile, real wages have started to grow. Inflation has moderated, and many of the larger businesses in our economy are recording record profits. So that doesn't look like the dystopia that we've been warned about. There is, though, an elephant in the room, and that is productivity. Now, one of the major criticisms of this IR agenda overall is that it will further weaken labour productivity in Australia. And it's true that our productivity is in a dismal state. But to fix it, we need to look at productivity holistically and understand that the government's efforts to provide basic workplace protections isn't inconsistent with an agenda we need to see if we were to enhance labour productivity in Australia. We need to accept that it's not just the productivity numbers that matter, but the way in which we achieve those numbers. There are two roads towards better labour productivity, in my view. The first is a lower road, a path that squeezes productivity out of our workforce, chasing greater output with the twin sticks of insecurity and gigification. But achieving productivity through this approach would be a Pyrrhic victory. It would improve living standards for some while making working lives harder for others. So my preference is that we take a higher road towards a more productive economy. And this path would tackle productivity by addressing all of its determinants. I want to see a productivity agenda that doesn't discard the best features and protections of our IR framework, basic protections like sick leave, workers' compensation or superannuation, but instead works to modernise these institutions so they can apply flexibly to the dynamic nature of a modern economy. I want to see flexibility in the jobs market achieved not by worsening job insecurity, but by dismantling employer-driven rigidities, like the excessive use of non-compete clauses and making entitlements like sick leave more portable. I want to see a productivity agenda that leverages competition policy to drive firm-level innovation and that more aggressively invests in the skills of workers. And I want to see this achieved with a renewed sense of collaboration and far less vitriol in our industrial relations debate. Now, younger voices such as Jessica's and mine, we have the luxury of not being beholden to the tired old tropes of the past. We don't need to rail against the activities of union thugs, nor do we need to treat bosses with an innate suspicion or an unfound animus. There's a middle path, and it's a path that brings people along for the journey, creates a level playing field for all businesses, and increases living standards. And that is a path I believe the government's IR agenda is consistent with. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.